The rugged beauty of the South Selkirk Mountains. Drawn from halfway around the globe, I now call this part of Canada home. My name is Bryce Comer. While the landscape is what originally captivated my imagination, the stories within it have become my passion. The Southern Selkirk Mountains lie in the interior wetbelt region, an area stretching from British Columbia, Canada, down into Montana, Idaho, and Washington State in the US. From its rugged peaks to its temperate rainforest, this ecosystem is truly unique. But it was a small group of animals living here that motivated me to tell this story. Their story. The Last Mountain Caribou. Early last century, this herd numbered in the hundreds and ranged as far south as the Salmon River in Idaho. By the turn of the century, despite conservation efforts in the 80s and 90s, their numbers were a shadow of what they once were. Conservation efforts continued though, and slowly the herd began to recover. In 2008, 46 caribou were counted. But that was the tipping point, and from that time on, their numbers would plummet. What appeared to me to be a healthy ecosystem was clearly failing the caribou. Their situation pointed to issues I needed to investigate to understand what was going on. Just north of the US borders of Washington and Idaho, Highway 3 winds its way up and over Kootenai Pass. Prime mountain caribou habitat. With more sightings reported from the shoulders of this highway than anywhere else in the herd's range, it was the obvious location to begin my search. With so few caribou spread over a range of almost 4,000 square kilometres, my first efforts at filming these elusive grey ghosts were a lesson in patience. But patience is a virtue, and finally, after 9 months of searching, I got my first sighting of the caribou. It came early one spring morning on the drive up to Kootenai Pass. Just short of the summit, right there in the middle of the road, was a group of more than a dozen caribou. Salt is used during winter to help make travel over the pass safer for motorists. An important resource for the caribou, the salt lures them here like a mineral lick in the forest. Just like a natural mineral lick has its dangers, so too does this one. Only here the dangers come in the form of passing vehicles. It doesn't take long though for the stronger animals to return and jostle for the deepest cracks where the most salt accumulates. Having shed their antlers earlier in the winter, the bull's new racks were just beginning to grow back. Cows shed their antlers later. Most of this group of cows still had their antlers, although not all of them had both. After so much time searching, it was a huge relief to finally lay eyes on part of the herd. So I'm just following an old set of caribou tracks here, and it's, I guess, 45 degrees here, and where they go up and over this ridge, it gets quite a bit steeper. Pretty amazing really to think that they live up here in these conditions and actually thrive, so long as their habitat is intact. The ongoing challenge of finding and filming the caribou would be my biggest hurdle. My compensation? Getting to know their surroundings. I must admit, finding fresh caribou tracks in the snow had me a little conflicted. I desperately needed footage of the caribou for the film, but had to keep in mind just how sensitive to disturbance these animals are. By tracking them, I could be perceived as a threat, and the last thing I wanted was to cause them any stress. Filming with long lenses would help mitigate my potential impact on the caribou, but the logistics of filming from behind a blind and constantly needing to be in the field were a challenge. This led me to the idea of using motion-activated cameras. These cameras would allow me to get shots of the caribou with little or no disturbance, and best of all, they would be at the ready to film the caribou at any time, day or night. After a couple of weeks and with much anticipation, I headed in to check what had been captured. To my disappointment though, all I managed to capture was a couple of shots of deer and an elk. Hardly the results I was hoping for. Undeterred, I kept at it, and a few months later, whilst checking the cameras, I stumbled upon an old trapper's set. It was then I realised I would have to think and work more like a trapper if I was to capture my quarry on film. I needed to find a place the caribou visited regularly and set out in search of signs that indicated their presence. Eventually I found a couple of areas with the signs I had been searching for and set up the cameras with more confidence. Again, I left the cameras for a couple of weeks before heading back in to check them. This time, though, my nervous anticipation became pure excitement with the discovery of caribou on not just one, but both cameras. At last, it looked like the time and effort I had invested was beginning to pay off. That was the turning point, and from that time on, my cameras captured many hours of footage. Not just footage of caribou either. It was great to be getting all these shots, but even though the footage was supposedly high definition, the image quality was less than ideal. I needed to find a remote camera that would shoot a higher quality video, but searching the internet, it seemed there was simply nothing available. After hours of fruitless searching, I began researching how to build my own remote cameras. Eventually, I found what I needed and set about putting the first cameras together. Since they'd be set up in bear country, I chose a sturdy metal box to house everything. I fitted a lock on the lid and a way of locking the whole thing to a tree. Of course, a hole would be needed for a glass lens, through which the camera would capture the video. A passive infrared sensor would be used to turn the cameras on and trigger the recordings. After a little work and much trial and error, I had some remote cameras that would capture high-quality images of the caribou without putting any stress on them. Of course, nothing worth having comes easy, and these remote cameras had issues of their own. Many times I would hike in to change batteries and download the footage, only to find the camera had malfunctioned. Batteries dying prematurely, condensation on the inside of the lens, and even foliage obscuring the view were just a few of the problems I regularly encountered. Each season had its own challenges with these remote cameras. The cold of winter proved to be very hard on the gear, especially batteries. Rainy weather was the main issue in spring and fall, and summer too had its challenges. But even with all these frustrations, the remote cameras were still my best option of getting the footage of the caribou throughout the year. Summer, and with the disappearance of the snows that kept the ground hidden for many months, plants and grasses come back to life. The cool, fresh air, crystal clear lakes and streams, and the abundance of food all add up to why this is not just the preferred domain of the caribou. With the snow now gone from all but the highest peaks, winter fades from memory. Still, the odd snowstorm sweeps through and is a stark reminder that summer is not the most dominant season here. At this time, the caribou live in small groups, dispersed across thousands of square kilometres of high elevation forest. They feed on the many different broadleaf plants, forbs and grasses, but won't pass up the arboreal lichens that sustain them through the winter. The bounty these mountains provide make it a great place to raise a family. But it's not just the caribou that take advantage of these conditions. Under the warm summer sunshine, wildflowers bloom, creating a kaleidoscope of colours. The sights and smells are a treat for the senses, and I feel privileged to spend time here. So I've just been hiking into an area to set up a trail camera, and I've come across a spectacular set of caribou antlers. I've only ever come across caribou antlers a couple of times before, but all of those antlers have been dropped antlers where the caribou shed them in early winter to reduce heat loss. These are different. These are still connected to the skull, and there's other bones scattered about the area here. So this animal has either died of natural causes or it's been predated on. Who knows? It's really interesting too to see how the ends of the antlers are chewed away, and many animals will do this, including caribou, and they do it to get some calcium in their diet, and that'll actually help them grow their next set of antlers. You know, the more I look at these antlers, the more I feel like I know this animal. They're a really unique shape. And I'm not sure whether I've seen this caribou before or I've seen it on one of my trail cameras. I was right. After a little bit of digging through old camera trap footage, there he was, a bull from September 2011. For more than a month until mid-October, my cameras captured many shots of this impressive creature. Most of that time, he had a small harem of cows, and I feel comfort in the thought he likely passed on his genes that year. More searching turned up this shot from late August that same year. It was captured just a few hundred meters from where I discovered the remains, and I couldn't help but wonder if these were the culprits in the mystery of how this bull met its end. You know, after all this time seeing the camera traps for the caribou, I'd like to think that I'm getting better at it. But with the herd's numbers dropping so rapidly over those same years, the number of shots that I'm getting mirrors those of the caribou. It's now at the point where I'm happy if I get just 1 or 2 shots in a month from all 9 of my cameras. Some months, though, I don't get any shots at all of the caribou, and that's a real concern. Shots like this one, though, of a cow with calf, that gets me super excited and gives me hope for the herd's survival. September, and the high country is ablaze in colour as the onset of another winter beckons. Freezing temperatures and the odd snowstorm, a reminder that these mountains will soon succumb to the frigid grip of winter. One day, whilst filming this black bear feeding on huckleberries, shots ring out, reminding me that hunting season was in full swing. Until the late 1970s, hunting played a big role in reducing the caribou's numbers and is a contributing factor to the situation we face today. The end of hunting these caribou was long overdue and without doubt bought the caribou a bit more time. With the cooler weather, the solitary tendencies of the caribou are set aside as the urge to reproduce takes over. The caribou seek each other out as their mating season, the rut, draws closer. Government biologists have fitted some of the caribou with GPS collars. These collars transmit daily coordinates along with other information crucial to the efforts for conserving the herd. As autumn progresses, most other large ungulates move down into the valleys to take shelter from the oncoming winter weather. Not the caribou. They remain up high and begin their rut. Bulls establish a hierarchy according to their size and strength, and the dominant bulls gather a harem of cows with which they will mate. Each year from mid-September till the end of October, I spend as much time as possible in the mountains attempting to film this behaviour. But with the herd's numbers dropping so rapidly, I never do get the chance and wonder if I will ever see this spectacle of nature. After the rut, the herd breaks up. Small groups of cows with young remain together. The older bulls go their own way, reconnecting with the others in late winter. With a break in the weather, I pack up the blind before it's buried by snow. I'll set it up again in spring in the hope of getting another chance to film the caribou. By November, most of the remaining animals have found a den for a deep sleep that will last through the long, dark winter months. Still, some hardy souls remain, undeterred by the bitter weather these mountains can deliver. As the snows continue to fall, the caribou rely on the old-growth forests for food. Here, the thick canopy allows them to feed on the evergreen shrubs that aren't yet covered in snow. Lichen blown off branches and trees blown down in storms also provide a good source of food at this time. Here in these forests, the caribou remain until the deeper snows of midwinter. With around 10 metres of annual snowfall, I need to check my cameras regularly. If not, they could be buried and I risk losing them entirely. The cold weather is tough on the equipment, but where to set the cameras up is the real challenge at this time of the year. With no trails or sign of the caribou to follow, all I can do is set each camera in an area I think the caribou will come to, and hope they do. This is rather typical. Bunch of caribou tracks here, and about 20 yards that way is a camera trap I've had set up all winter. So they've missed it by 20 yards, literally. It can be incredibly rewarding camera trapping, but more often than not, it's pretty frustrating. Midwinter in the valleys, and the shallow snow makes it easier for the animals here to find food. Up in the mountains, the snow can be 3 to 4 metres deep and is firm enough to support the caribou's weight. Now the caribou do something unique and move up to the high elevation forests. With their large crescent-shaped hooves, they stand on top of the deep snow to reach the lichens that hang from the trees here. While low in protein, they are easily digested and an abundant source of energy. Over thousands of years, the caribou have adapted to live on the lichens in these mountains. In doing so, they maintained a distance between themselves and other prey species, and their predators. It's not only the caribou that are attracted to the deep snow here. Our appetite for adrenaline has drawn us to these mountains. Now more than ever, we can venture further into the backcountry with far less effort. The downside to all this fun, though, is the impact it can have on the caribou. These often noisy and fast-moving sports can startle the caribou, using up valuable energy and forcing them from their preferred habitat. A worst-case scenario would be to force them into steeper, more avalanche-prone terrain. It's not only the direct impact on the caribou caused by these sports. These mountains have historically been out of reach of predators due to the very deep snow. While the caribou are well adapted to live up in these mountains, for most animals, including predators, navigating this much snow takes far too much energy. However, the tracks left behind by our activities pack the snow down and make it far easier for those same predators to access areas normally out of reach due to the deep snowpack. Without the human presence, though, winter in the mountains is rather quiet. While it's not devoid of life, normally it's only tracks that give away the presence of anything living here. Occasionally, though, I'm lucky enough to catch a glimpse of what made those tracks. In this mountainous area, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest ocean, a unique rainforest has evolved over millennia. Unlike most other temperate rainforests in the world, this rainforest derives a large part of its moisture from snow. However, the weather these mountains are renowned for appears to be changing. For the mountain caribou and so many other species that call this place home, this change in weather could be disastrous. With snows coming later in the year and the snow melt coming earlier, things in the mountains are drying out like never before. Forest fires are becoming a far bigger threat to areas that historically were rarely threatened by fire. Scientists are warning of higher fluctuations in both temperature and precipitation in the future. This would result in far greater changes in snowpack depths from one winter to the next. A well above average snowpack could bury lower hanging lichens and kill them off. If the following winter has a far less than average snowpack, the caribou may simply be unable to reach the food they so desperately need. While the weather is always changing and all living things must adapt to survive, the change is happening faster than ever before, begging the question, given their current situation, will these caribou have enough time to adapt to the change? April in the valleys heralds the arrival of spring. All the animals that have survived the winter are now enjoying what Mother Nature has on offer. Up in the mountains, winter's grip on the landscape is only just beginning to weaken. So I'm just wandering around the back of the roadworks yard here, and I've come across a bunch of old caribou tracks. Not unusual, but they've got old wolf tracks in them. So on my drive up this morning, I saw a bunch of other prey species, mule deer, white-tailed deer, an elk, a moose, and they were just down the road below the snow line. So why the wolves are up here hunting the caribou, I don't know. Sadly, just a few days later, I got word that one of the bulls had been lost to wolf predation. No doubt, the tracks I found were from one of these wolves. Finally, in late May, the longer, warmer days begin to melt the deep snow and transform the landscape. Now the caribou move back down. Here they feed on the fresh new growth in the already snow-free areas at lower elevations. As the snow line retreats up the mountainsides, fresh new growth is exposed in its wake. The caribou follow this fresh food source back up until once again they find themselves high in the mountains. In an effort to find new areas to set remote cameras for the caribou, I hiked into this small valley. The steep mountains surrounding me had me wondering if I had chosen the spot wisely. Mountain goats and bighorn sheep could clamber up these slopes, but would the caribou use this area? Shortly after, I got my answer. There at the base of an avalanche path were the remains of a caribou. With so few animals left, every caribou lost is of great concern. Not knowing how old the remains were or what had caused its death, all I could do was take some photos to send the authorities. The following week, I hiked back in with biologists Leo de Groot and Norm Meurs to examine the remains more closely. They were hoping to find out how and when this animal died.
And that tooth is still in there, 3 cusps, kind of sharp, and a relatively small rock. It was probably a yearling bull.
They determined it was a young bull and likely died the previous autumn, ruling out an avalanche.
Young critter.
Due to a lack of evidence, death by natural causes couldn't be ruled out, but the neat pile of remains was typical of a bear or cougar kill. With all the wolf scat at the scene, though, it was possible a lone wolf was the culprit.
There's a fair bit of scat around it.
Perhaps the only positive to come out of their investigation was that he had died before the last count and would at least not further reduce that number. While the caribou have always fallen victim to predators, things in the last century have changed. The balance that once allowed the caribou to maintain their numbers despite this natural predation has been altered. As unthinkable as it seems today, early on last century, prospectors would regularly set fire to whole mountainsides in search of gold. As it turns out, this was only the start of the destruction of this ecosystem that over the years would tighten like a noose around the caribou's necks. By the 1940s, with mining in a slump, timber took over as the main industry in the area. Since then, we have wiped out most of the old-growth forests. More than anything else, logging has altered the landscape and changed the balance of nature. Historically, browsers like deer, elk and moose have favoured the valley bottoms and lower slopes for most of the year. Logging, though, has expanded the amount of habitat favourable to these species. Extending all the way from the valley bottoms to the alpine, the cut blocks from logging have taken away the isolation that for millennia has allowed the caribou to thrive here. With near-perfect conditions for browsers in these cut blocks, the number and range of these other deer species has greatly expanded. Naturally, in response to the abundance of prey, predator numbers have also increased. This unnaturally high number of predators and prey species in the heart of the caribou's home has been their kryptonite. Through no fault of the predators, they now encounter the caribou more often than ever before, and these chance encounters rarely end well for the caribou. Add to this the diseases carried by white-tailed deer that the caribou have no defence against, and it's clear that the changes to the environment caused by logging have far-reaching implications. Of course, all this industry requires roads to transport the goods to market. Highway 3 is the main road linking east to west in the area and cuts right through the middle of the caribou's home. Over the years, there have been a number of losses due to vehicle collisions, but no doubt many more caribou have been lost to this road and never reported. With the GPS collars on some of the animals, it is now possible to warn motorists if the caribou are near the highway. Other options too, like radar, are being considered and could potentially reduce collisions with the caribou. In addition to the threats found on and around the highway, power and gas lines have created linear features that allow predators to travel further using less energy. With clear sight lines, they can find and hunt down their prey far easier than they would in natural forest. In 1995, with mountain caribou disappearing across southern British Columbia, the first census was made, and 2,500 caribou were counted. Just 2 decades on, and that number has been halved. Our mismanagement of the ecosystem goes back decades and has led to the situation we face today. So I've just been sitting here listening to a pack of wolves howling. Super cool experience. Actually, this is the second time that I've heard them in this area. Just hoping they're going to start up again. I've seen a couple of wolves up here, but I've only managed to film one once. They're pretty secretive animals and they don't stick around very long. Actually, since I started this film, I've seen more and more sign of wolves up here, which has been really neat. But I guess in the beginning, I didn't really understand the impact they were having on the caribou. Government biologists too were taking note of all the extra wolves in the area. And by 2014, with 60% of the herd lost, they began a wolf cull. Not a very popular move with many of the environmental groups, and understandably so. Their fear, I guess, is that the wolf cull is simply the government's attempt at keeping caribou on the landscape whilst maintaining the status quo with logging. Despite the unpopularity, the wolf cull appears to be helping the herd's numbers stabilise. In March 2017, biologists counted 11 animals, a loss of just 1 animal from the previous year. Certainly encouraging, but much more work needs to be done. While most of the caribou's core habitat here has now been protected, it will take time for the cut blocks to grow back and become less suitable to other prey species. The reality is that until then, wildlife management will be necessary to ensure the caribou are still around to take advantage of those protections. Plans for a maternal penning program like this one to the north in Revelstoke are underway and will be a key tool in the conservation of this herd. Ultimately, restoring connectivity between the herds will ensure the future for all the remaining southern mountain caribou. Hopefully in time, our need to manage the wildlife will diminish and a natural predator-prey balance will be restored, ensuring not only the survival of the caribou, but so many other species that call this place home. We know what needs to be done to keep animals like the caribou and other iconic species on this landscape. The question is, are we prepared to make the sacrifices needed to make it happen? Around the end of May and into early June, pregnant cows venture high up into the mountains. There they will give birth to a single calf. The calves are quick to their feet and stick to their mother's side to stay safe and learn how to live up in these mountains. Sadly, the majority of all calves born each year won't make it through the summer. The odds are stacked up against this little one, but if we make the tough decisions to protect the ecosystem, her odds will greatly improve. Hopefully in a couple of years' time, she will produce a calf of her own, helping to ensure the survival of her species.
The tiptoes on the bedroom floor, these quiet eyes are spinning in the dark. A secret wish that none will know, she keeps it locked up in her pale heart. Wait for it, it's tired and it's true. Wait for it, it's all she ever knew. She ever knew. The background hum of city streets and whispers from the neighbors intertwine.